1 second. We all have to press our record buttons, and I'm just going to pull up my information. But welcome, everyone. This is the keynote session of our 44th annual conference with the California Preservation Foundation, and we want to welcome everybody to the room. I'm just here to get you started. What we'd like you to know is that everybody's encouraged to post in the chat window while we are having the presentation. If you post in the chat, make sure you hit the all panelists and attendees, and you'll see other people inside the chat room. If that chat box does disturb your experience, you can pull it to the side. I'd like to introduce my fellow producer right there, John Haber, and he is going to be helping me in the background along with Gretchen Hilliard. You'll see all three of us in the chat room. This presentation will have a Q&A at the end. If you can post your questions during the conversation in that Q&A, our special friend, Christine Lazaredo, who I'll introduce in a minute, will be running that Q&A in a few minutes. So it's my honor, and I'd love to introduce Christine Lazaredo. She is the president of the Board of Trustees of the California Preservation Foundation.
Thank you, Chris, and good morning, everyone. As Chris mentioned, I'm Christine Lazaredo. I'm the current president of the California Preservation Foundation. On behalf of the organization, I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this year's conference entitled Reframing Preservation, Leading from the West Coast. As you can tell from the title, we set an ambitious agenda for this year's conference, which is organized around 4 core values: imagination and vision, excellence and innovation, relevance, and repair. Our intention with this framework is to take a step back and think about heritage conservation in the broader context of today's world. How can we be better listeners? How can we be more inclusive in the stories we tell and the places we recognize? What is our role in issues such as social justice, climate change, and the housing crisis? And how can we as an organization promote best practices and keep pushing boundaries on a technical level? We look forward to exploring all of this and more with all of you over the next 3 days. But first, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the organizations and individuals who support the work of CPF. Thank you to all of our conference sponsors and nonprofit partners who made this event possible, enabling us to organize more than 20 sessions with over 80 speakers and allowing us to offer free conference registration to all students for the first time. And thanks to our annual sponsors, whose generosity supports all of our educational and advocacy efforts throughout the year. This year's conference committee is a brilliant and formidable group who helped us to rethink the possibilities for this year's event and then work tirelessly to create content that we hope will advance preservation practice in California and beyond. Many, many thanks to all of you. And finally, or I should say last but not least, for all of their hard work, determination, and creativity, I'd like to recognize our remarkable staff. Executive Director Cindy Heitzman, John Haber, Field Services Director, and Christine Madrid-French, Development and Marketing Director. And now, I am honored to introduce our keynote address featuring Robert Stanton and Julianne Polanco in conversation about the present and future of historic preservation in the United States. Julianne Polanco is California's State Historic Preservation Officer. Prior to being appointed to that post in 2015, she served as the Commissioner and Chair of the State Historical Resources Commission, the Director of Cultural Resources for Lend-Lease Americas, and was the Acting Federal Preservation Officer at the Presidio Trust in San Francisco. Robert Stanton is a former Senior Advisor to the Secretary of the Interior, former Director of the National Park Service. He served on the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation under President Obama, and he's currently a consultant and lecturer in natural and cultural resource preservation, park management, and diversity. Mr. Stanton was the first African-American to serve as director of the Park Service, nominated by President Clinton in 1997. This capped off a 35-year career with the NPS that began with his 1962 appointment as a seasonal park ranger at Grand Teton National Park. I encourage you to read more about both of our plenary speakers on the conference website. I certainly can't do justice to their illustrious careers in just a few minutes of introduction. And with that, I'd like to welcome you both for being here, and thank you for being here today. I certainly can't think of a better way to open this year's conference, and I know that I'm joined by all of our guests in giving you a warm welcome to California. And now I'd like to turn things over to Julianne Polanco. Thank you.
Okay, well, I just got my unmute out early. Thanks everyone for organizing and for being with us today. As Chris said, I'm Julie Polanco. I'm so honored to be your State Historic Preservation Officer. And what a pleasure it is today to be in conversation with the distinguished and thoughtful Robert Stanton. It was my pleasure to work with Bob on the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation as a SHPO, and in particular efforts about diversity and inclusion. You're in for a treat, and I can't wait to get started. I want to also acknowledge that the first section 1 of the National Historic Preservation Act, which is now 55 years old, and I will read in quote, "Congress finds and declares that the spirit and direction of the nation are founded upon and reflected in its historic heritage. The historical and cultural foundations of the nation should be preserved as a living part of our community life and development in order to give a sense of orientation to the American people. Historic properties are significant to the nation's heritage, are being lost or substantially altered, often inadvertently with increasing frequency. And the preservation of this irreplaceable heritage is in the public's interest so that its vital legacy of culture, education, aesthetic, inspirational, economic, and energy benefits will be maintained and enriched for future generations of Americans." I keep a copy of this on my desk as a constant reminder of the value statement there, and one that we all strive for every day in our public work and our private lives, to be sure that we are giving our communities the tools they need to thrive, to be proud, to celebrate and commemorate their past, and to give hope and an anchor for the future. Wanted to start by asking Bob a couple of questions. You've had a long and distinguished career in the National Park Service, beginning in the early 60s and culminating with your directorship in 1997. In the time the country was on a trajectory of change, civil rights, women's rights, communities finding and using their voices to drive social change and to be more representative and diverse. And I wondered if you could give us an insight of the NPS during that time, both how it responded in programming and leadership as it relates to cultural resources and stewardship, and just what you saw at the time and where we are. It would be great to hear that. So I'll just stop there and ask you if you would give us some words.
Thank you very much, Julie. Let me hasten to thank you and Cindy and your respective staffs at the Office of State Historic Preservation, and certainly the California Preservation Foundation, for this tremendous opportunity to be with you. And in that light, I want to thank our good friend, Wayne Donaldson, for introducing me to the California Preservation Foundation. Wayne, as we all know, served with distinction as chairman of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. Julie, to speak briefly about my association, my employment with the National Park Service. I could spend days with you because it was such a wonderful, wonderful journey. But I had the privilege, I had the honor of being selected as a seasonal ranger working in Grand Teton National Park in '62, an opportunity made possible through the courageous leadership of Stuart Lee Udall. The leadership that was exhibited publicly was 2 years before the enactment of the Civil Rights Act of '64. But to just comment briefly about the National Park Service and its programming activities relative to cultural resource preservation, I think it would be mutually beneficial to just briefly outline the journey on which we have traveled from the day that the National Park Service was authorized in 1916. The Park Service authorized during World War I. We immediately suffered from the Great Depression. Congress enacted the Historic Sites Act of '35. Congress and President Roosevelt approved the Reorganization Act of the executive branch in 1933. Shortly thereafter, we entered into World War II, followed by the Korean War, the Vietnam War. Then we saw the advent of the interstate highway system. We saw the phenomenon of urban renewal. We saw the beginning of the civil rights, the modern civil rights movement. All of this was taking place that influenced this young agency known as the National Park Service. And when I entered Grand Teton National Park in '62, we were at the height, if you will, of the modern civil rights movement. We marched the streets, we protested in front of the White House, we stood on the Capitol, on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, arguing for equal rights under the Constitution of the United States. But there was a great awareness that was beginning to take place with respect to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring book issued in the '60s. The Historic Preservation Act you cited so eloquently in 1966. So the director of the Park Service coming aboard under the leadership of Stuart Udall was confronted with a new environment, a new society that was not envisioned perhaps at the beginning of the Park Service. So they took all of these changes into heart and manifested them into reprioritizing the work of the National Park Service so that its work would reflect the interests of an increasingly diverse population, such as providing equal employment opportunities, advocating for areas within the park system that would represent our diverse cultural heritage, expanding efforts to provide recreational opportunities in close proximity to urban centers. So because of all the events that had taken place from 1916 until the 60s, there was a major shift and there was a sensitivity to have a park service reflecting the interests and the needs of the American people. But I will just conclude with that brief overview that what took place in the 60s and subsequently relative to the National Park Service can only be attributed to courageous leadership. And the legacy of Stuart Lee Udall and that of George B. Hartzell are textbooks example of courageous stewardship. And let me just quote from you verbatim, George Hartzell's acknowledgement of the challenge that he accepted. He states that the National Park Service established in 1916, we interpreted more sites of Indian culture than the Indian themselves, but did not have a single American Indian as superintendent. We administered the George Washington Carver National Monument, the Booker T. Washington Monument, and the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site, yet we did not have an African-American superintendent. And except for the talented, gracious lady whom we inherited with the Adams Mansion National Historic Site, we did not have one woman serving as the superintendent of the national park, and this was in 1916. George Hartzell, Stuart Lee Udall changed that. And we have been on a course of positivity in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion ever since. Surely we have not made the ground that we wanted to make, but it's a struggle that continues. It continues, it continues.
Thank you, Bob. That root, those foundations are so important to understanding that legacy that we've inherited, the beautiful legacy that we continue and to inspire us to think about how have we done and where are we? I love the term courageous stewardship. I think that in every effort we make as public servants, it's our responsibility to make sure that every aspect, as you mentioned, not just the public face, but how are we providing opportunities for our youth? What are we doing to make sure that our organization, our structure, our people, our strength look like our communities? And I'm wondering what your thoughts are right now about where we are now. What are you seeing in cultural resource management? And how are we ensuring that all stories important to communities are being told?
I really appreciate that question, Julie. We are now a nation of 330 million plus, representing individuals from all backgrounds, racial, ethnic, heritage. And we have a responsibility at the local, state, regional, and national levels to be responsive and sensitive to the cultures and the traditions of all our people. And if you were to take a look at the 423 areas that constitute the national park system, they are beginning to reflect, if you will, the face of America in terms of our diverse cultural heritage. But Julie, I'll be the first to admit we still have a ways to go. One thing that I did not mention when I spoke about the milestones starting from 1916 up to today, there was a shadow, a very insidious shadow that hung over us as a people and as a nation. The pains of that shadow and the stains of that shadow still exist with us today. And I would hope that our fellow participants in this conference will address those pains. And I speak specifically of a Supreme Court decision handed down in 1896. 1896, that set into motion some of the ills that we confront today. That decision rendered that it was constitutional for us to live separately but equal. Separate but equal, an insidious decision. And I lived painfully under that doctrine for 24 years. There was absolutely nothing equal under that doctrine. And it was not until 1954 that we as a people, as a nation, dealt with that. Partially, that is, when a native son of California wrote the majority opinion in the 1954 Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education. And he cited, "We find unanimously that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place." Earl Warren. But it was not until 1964 that a fellow native son of Texas signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that totally reversed that insidious decision of 1896, saying that separate but equal has no place, in any function, any institution in the United States. We lived by law as a divided people, and there are scars that have yet to be healed. But through cultural resource preservation, we tell our past and hope that we can learn from grievous mistakes where we have stumbled as we forge toward building a more perfect union. So I applaud the practitioners in cultural resource preservation. I applaud the students and the young people who are with us in the audience. Accept the challenge of where we are and where we might go. Cultural resources provide sources of learning and inspiration and provocation that hopefully will direct us to continue on that noble journey towards a more perfect union.
Thank you, Bob, for those amazing words and sharing that important context with us. I think that, what I always say, that the beauty of history is there's room for everyone and there's room for every story. It's an unlimited capacity to tell all of the stories so that we're sure we understand and learn from those very hard experiences. And I think you're right, the preamble of the Constitution that says in order to create a more perfect union challenges us, and I think tells us, demands us that we continue to do better. We continue to understand and learn that there's always room to improve. And I think history and culture play such an important role in sharing stories and binding us together with commonalities of food and celebration and family, in ways that I think no other can. And it behooves us, I think, as practitioners to strive to do that every day in all of our work. You speak a lot to truth. And I'm wondering what this means to you, and what does the role truth play in preservation? Where are we now? In this amazing moment, I think of a resurgence of social justice and this vast lockdown that we've all been under, and the stresses of a global pandemic have really shined the light on the gaps and the fissures of society, but equally on the things that are so important to us. Community and family have, I think, been so much strengthened in our resolve to survive this, if we will. And I wonder what you think about truth and how these lessons combined will help us remerge and transition to a new world and a better space.
Thank you, Julie. I'm glad I was not one of your students when you may have been a professor. I would hope that you would have graded on the curve, because I definitely would come up with an F minus. Those are some difficult questions that you posed. You're right on target about truth. And what I'm trying to resolve in my own mind, and I would pose this maybe as a challenge not only to you, but to our other conference participants. Are we using, and have I been using, it's a question to myself, have I been using the concept of truth synonymously with telling the full story? I think there may be some of us who can perceive that the full story does not necessarily include all of the truths about that particular challenge. We interpreted the U.S. Civil War, from 1865 up until today. And you reading the textbooks, and when people talk about, well, that's the story of the Civil War. But we did not talk about American Indian who fought in the Civil War. We did not talk about Latinos who fought in the Civil War. We did not talk about the 200,000 African Americans who fought in the Civil War, women who fought in the Civil War, notwithstanding they were disguised as men. So we're not telling the truth. We're telling maybe the full story, but the full story did not contain all the truths about that. We talk about our conflict, our atrocities wrought on American Indians, as an example. Told that story at Custer's battlefield. But now we speak about it in the Battle of the Bighorn, to tell the full story, to tell the truth about the views and the custom and the values and what American Indians were fighting for bravely to protect their homeland. Tell the truth, all of the truth. So I'm very supportive of telling the full story of all the people, but I want to pull back the cover a little bit to say that, are you telling all? Are you telling all? And I just close on this observation from a comment made by President Biden on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the massacre at Tulsa, Oklahoma. He said that the cover of darkness might be used to hide the truth, but it erases nothing. The truth is the truth, and it's going to stay the truth. Why don't we accept it? Why don't we learn from it? Why don't we convey the significance of knowing about the truth and hope that we can learn from it and make improvements? So you posed a question that I got to resolve in my own mind when we said telling the full story. By whose definition is the full story? That's the challenge that I would pose to all of us.
I couldn't agree with you more. And you were speaking and I kept hearing the words, "The truth will set us free." And I think
Yes.
that's what we all strive for. We strive to see the truth as part of the narrative so that we can all understand the contributions and the atrocities equally so important to creating that more perfect union for all Americans. And
Yes, right.
I think in that space, a great celebration of togetherness and the strength of this country continues. And I think that you're right, that truth and inspiration comes from truth. And in that knowledge, we're all better equipped to move forward as a more perfect union.
If I may, just as a footnote to that, Julie, and this I know that's being addressed during the course of the conference. I'm not a historian, but I hope I'm learning from history, that the concept of looking at history in terms of layers is that if you will take a look at some of the state parks or the historic sites or the national parks, there may be a primary theme in terms of what you're going to do about preserving and interpreting resources. But as you dig deeper into it, you find out there are many more rich stories and experiences that have taken place on the same ground or the same building. And I think that's the challenge as we prepare a National Register nomination, to see whether or not that nomination is inclusive of all the stories, all the truth about the significance of that site of the building. And that's a challenge that we have, I think, in the preservation community.
It is, and absolutely. And the beauty of the National Register nominations is that they can be amended. They're living documents.
Yes, yes.
And as we know more and we unveil more and we understand more and we share more, that gets added to the rich mosaic of our country. And space really, to me, is the container for stories, right? It grounds those stories in the physicality, but the intangible heritage and the expanding definition of cultural heritage really is beginning to encompass and celebrate all of these themes that have been absent and that really enrich our lives and our future. And I think that preservation engaging in these ways in non-traditional areas with partners that we wouldn't normally engage with, environmental groups and human rights activists. And I think the way that we are embracing community through culture to solve these problems collectively rather than in silos, to create this holistic approach, is much more sustainable and more complete.
Right.
And I wonder how you see these partnerships in preservation with non-traditional partners, especially enriching us, and also just to sort of bring us around so that we can have some time for some questions. How would you challenge us as preservationists? And then how can we also encourage partners to join with us? I know there are lots of questions. I'm a really fair grader because it's all about conversation and sharing story. And there is no wrong or right answer, right? My mom was a school teacher and she used to say there was no such thing as a dumb question. And I believe that to be true, that we are all people who are learning every day and compelling ourselves to do so and share with others. How do you encourage us to change as preservationists? What are things we can focus on with partnerships? And then perhaps a bit of inspiration as we unfortunately need to close our time to open up for questions. What sort of words would you leave us with to inspire us into action?
Thank you again, Julie. But partnerships, cooperation in collaboration with a variety or a wide range of audiences is critically important. To preserve our heritage, it requires, as they would say in the Navy, all hands on deck. And these resources, again, are sources of learning and inspiration. And I like the kind of partnerships that exist between your office and the foundation with the National Park Service. And I certainly want to applaud my fellow and former colleagues in the National Park Service of engaging with the state and political subdivision. Just as a bottom line, there's no substitute of the value of working cooperatively and collaboratively across organizational and community and racial and ethnic lines. And I would just encourage that to continue. I would like to close because I do know the opportunity is so valuable to interact with the audience. And I comment more in response to your question more philosophically, because one who has enjoyed this sweet earth for 80+1, have seen a lot of changes, seen a lot of sunsets. And I've often wondered, what really keep us committed as a nation, as a people, to strive towards that more perfect union. And there's one provision in the Constitution of the United States that in the end give us hope that we have the courage to stay on this noble journey. And it's expressed in the 14th Amendment, simply this: equal protection of the laws. I am convinced that we'll continue to make tremendous advancement in medicine, space exploration, all kinds of technological ways of automating various systems. But all of that will be for naught, based on my experience, will all be for naught if we do not continue to embrace and try to act upon assuring that every American citizen benefit from the guarantee that we have made to ourselves: equal protection of the laws. For some reason, we have not embraced it, but we'll have to if we are going to survive as a people, as a nation. I would leave you this one thought, because I have burning deeply within me the legacy of one of my all-time heroes. I often say that he and I joined the National Park Service in the same year. In that in June of 1962, I donned the green and gray as a seasonal ranger in Grand Teton. And on September 5, President John F. Kennedy signed legislation making his home the place of his death in 1895 as a unit of the National Park System. I speak of none other than Mr. Frederick Douglass. His spirit burns within me. He would advocate that all progress is born of earnest struggle, and we must stay in the struggle for freedom, dignity, liberty for all. But he also offered this, and I know I'm going over time, but he also left us this wisdom. And if we were to embrace it, we would understand what our obligations are to move towards diversity, equity, inclusion, and dignity. And I'll be very brief. In the words of Mr. Douglass, our best and most valued acquisitions have been obtained either from our contemporaries or from those who have preceded us in the field of thought and discovery. We have reaped where others have sown, and that which others have sown, we have gathered. It must in truth be said that no possible native force of character and no depth or wealth of originality can lift a man into absolute independence of his fellow man. And no generation of man can be independent of the preceding generation. The brotherhood and interdependence of mankind are guarded and defended at all points. I believe in individuality, but individuals are to the mass like waves to the ocean. The highest order of genius is as dependent as is the lowest. It is like the lofty waves of the sea, which derives its power and greatness from the grandeur and vastness of the ocean of which it forms a part. We differ as the waves, but we are one as the sea. That's our business, ladies and gentlemen, to forge opportunities for us to recognize and embrace the wisdom of Mr. Douglas. We differ, yes, but we are one. We are one as a sea. Thank you again, Julie, for this opportunity. And thank the audience for this grand opportunity to be with you.
Thank you so much, Bob, for bringing us back, for those words, for your work and leadership, your courageous leadership through such an amazing time in the country. You and your colleagues, those that came before us, give us such foundation to continue on our path to create a more perfect union. We didn't get a chance to talk about the youth that we have so much hope, give us hope every day to carry this on, this legacy in ways that they find important. I'm already inspired by the fact that young people don't have the struggles or the barriers that we do, to see that so much more is possible in this space. And I think that preservation gives us this ability to have a format and a binding agent to have these conversations in order to truly create a more perfect union. Thank you so much, Bob, for those words. I see that we have a couple of questions, and one of them is for you. What do you see new national parks looking like? What kinds of resources should we be thinking about that we haven't seen yet? We'll start with that question, then Chris, if you've got some others from the group, we'll move on to there.
Thank you very much. What has occurred over the past 3 or 4 decades is the addition to the national park system that more fully reflect our diversity, our struggles, our accomplishments. I should just mention as a point of interest that there's 2 things that the National Park Service cannot do through the director. The Park Service cannot establish a unit of the national park system, nor when a unit is established, it cannot divest its interests in managing that area. So when you take a look at the national park areas, the 423, they were either established by a congressional act or by the president exercising the authority under the Antiquities Act of 1906. And those authorities, congressional legislation and presidential proclamations, have given greater emphasis to commemorate our struggles, our accomplishments, and our dreams. That will continue. There must be no less than 12 to 15 studies underway that may eventually include additional sites of in the national park system. The Rosenwald schools, as an example, the so-called Mexican schools that experienced de facto segregation in my home state of Texas on the border. So new areas will be coming into the system, trying to tell us about the truth, and hope that again, that we're going to learn from our history in order to forge a better future.
Thank you for that. Chris, we'll turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you. And I just want to quickly also introduce Cindy Heitzman, who is going to be joining us during the Q&A as well. Cindy's the Executive Director of CPF, for those of you who don't already know her. So I just want to take a second to thank both Julianne Polanco and Robert Stanton for that spectacular talk, which is the perfect way to open this conference and address a lot of the themes that we've all been talking about for the last few months. And I want to just encourage everyone in the audience to please take this opportunity to ask questions. I don't know when we'll have these two together in a room again, so I hope that you will take this opportunity to pose a lot of questions. I do have one in the box that I'd like to throw out to both of you. And I think this also goes along with a lot of the things we've been talking about for this conference about balance. So there's a lot of new legislation coming forward to help increase affordable housing opportunities, which is of course something we desperately need here in California. However, it also means maybe some questions about historic resources and historic neighborhoods. So do either of you see any significant changes on the horizon, either at the state or federal levels, that could help protect historic built environment resources and cultural, including archaeological and tribal resources, beyond what we already have in place, or maybe some things that we should be thinking about as these two forces converge in the next few years?
I will defer to Julie, but well, with the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, there was a great deal of cooperation, collaboration between the Advisory Council and the leadership of HUD, looking at ways in which the tax incentive and other measures could be maximized to provide affordable housing in private properties. And I see that continuing. And I would hope that Congress and this leadership and future leaderships of the administration will see the value of the tax incentive program. The concern I do have along those lines, I am not aware to what extent minority and women owners of properties that would lend themselves to being approved under the tax incentive program. I think we need to continue to encourage a wide range of property owners, particularly in our diverse communities, to participate in these programs.
Thank you for that, Bob. And I agree. I think that you know, in looking sort of at what's before us, California has passed a state historic tax credit program, thanks in large part to CPF and its members and partners. We're looking forward to when the legislature funds that program so we can get it started. I think that, you know, we have the systematic frameworks of the National Register and historic context statements and sort of the information about how we can remove barriers to participation in the National Register that we're all working on, both at the state, local, and federal levels. I think it's sort of a long-term view and a short-term view, specifically about affordable housing. Don Rupkema and his group at Heritage Strategies has done a recent study about the compatibility of these two goals. I think in the idea of our partnerships being more expansive for common goals, this couldn't be a more perfect conversation to have in that space. In my personal opinion, I think that we have the tools that we need to make intelligent decisions, but I really think that there needs to be the flexibility for those decisions to be made at the local level. Communities need to really think about and drive what's important to them. As we know in California, one size does not fit all. So our laws need to be specific enough that they give us direction and flexible enough that they give us the opportunity to really address the needs of each communities in long-term and sustaining ways. And I think by these strong partnerships, maybe with unusual partners or those that we're not, you know, really typically working with, we find these strengths and we can find these coexisting wins. And I think that really from a preservation standpoint, engagement, cooperation, and being at the table and being part of those partner solutions will really be the strength that gets us to the success that we need to see.
Yes, good, very good.
Agreed. We have some other questions in. This question is actually to both you, Julie and Director Stanton. What was a significant personal experience that revealed the importance of historical cultural sites and their meaning to yourself and or community?
If I may, Julie, it would be the rehabilitation of the home of Mr. Douglas. It's interesting how that impacted me, because I really had no full embracement of what was involved in preparing the home. But what was so interesting is that the home came into the park system in 1962, but it was in such a bad shape that it was closed to the public, what have you, until such time that Congress appropriated sufficient funding to rehabilitate it. And that did not occur until 1970. It so happened that I was appointed superintendent of the park in which Mr. Douglas' home existed. And it was a enriching experience, because it was my hero. And I was appointed, as the Park Service newsletter would read, the Park Service appoints its first Negro superintendent. And to have as my charge Mr. Douglas' home, and to be joined by Secretary Roger B. Martin of Interior to publicly announce that funds have been appropriated to restore the home of Mr. Douglas, which has been described by the preeminent historian Benjamin Quall as a marvel of preservation. That was my first introduction. That was my first learning experience of historic preservation that has enriched and continued to enrich my life.
Wow, that's amazing and hard to follow, but so inspirational. Thank you, Bob. And I think for me, it's, I grew up with a mother who was a school teacher and interested in history, and a father in architecture and engineering. So I feel like I had sort of no choice but to be where I am today. But I think it's that I grew up in a small rural community in Northern California that was multicultural. We had Japanese American farmers who had been interned in the camps. We knew that story. The grocery store was owned by a Chinese American family, many of whom came from, to be part of the gold rush. And so these swirling stories of multiculturalism, the Mexican American farm workers that were in our community, including some of my grandparents, and seeing and learning stories in the formal context of education, and then looking in my community and knowing these other stories, and really not understanding why there wasn't more of a correlation between and among all of them, and why I didn't see the stories of my grandfather, who was a welder for the Southern Pacific Railroad, why I didn't see the stories of our Japanese American neighbors who, one gentleman saved the farm and returned it back to others when they came from the internment camps. And so for me, it was this upbringing of multiculturalism that didn't reflect in our formal education, and the desire to be sure that all stories of the public were told so that the community and people could learn what they want rather than what they were directed to. And I strive to do that every day in this role, to really be a public servant in the true sense. And Bob, you mentioned courageous leadership, that it's our challenge and our honor to be sure that we are serving every member of our public as best we can. And for me, it was more broad than a specific thing, but I think it's what motivates me every day to continue in this work.
I sense too, Julie, that the spirit of one of our mutual heroes, and certainly was a hero of Secretary Cesar Chavez, that his spirit burns deeply in you.
Oh, thank you. I share this story often, that when I was a little girl, we weren't allowed to eat grapes for many summers, and it never made sense to me as a child. And I'm so grateful that my parents provided that framework and that value in us to really think about others and what community truly means.
Yes.
I feel like it's the same in our climate change work. We can't, we're compelled to work on the earth in these larger holistic landscapes. We are so blessed in California to have 109 federally recognized tribes, 145 total. I think I've got that number pretty close. Tribal nations in California, many partners with whom we have the pleasure of engaging every day. And I really feel that all of us, all the work you do to show the world that it's what's possible and encourage and inspire others to join us is really the strength of this state, and history provides such a great opportunity for us to do that.
Yeah. I tell you, it's always a joy to come to California, and you spoke about in Senate raised about enduring experiences, and one of the highlights of my experience, and felt good that our nation is beginning to be better. When Congress passed legislation, while I was the director of the Park Service, authorizing the Timish Shoshone tribe to have perpetual ownership and use of homeland resources within Death Valley National Park. Long overdue, long overdue. And to visit with the chief and the tribe member was a memorable experience for me personally.
I agree. And I think, it's also important to stop and think about the progress we've made. Celebration is part and commemoration are both part of the National Historic Preservation Act. And sometimes celebrating doesn't seem the right word, but I think also oftentimes we do need to stop and think about the progress we've made and really look at how far we have still to go.
Yes.
And I think remember to be cognizant of that, creating a more perfect union, going back to the beginning of the words that you gave us, Bob, because I think it guides us that we're always creating and we're always doing better, and we're never going to be the perfect union.
No.
But we should always be striving together for that. And preservation, I think, in the work that you all do every day, our audience and our partners really does lend to the strength of that in those communities' values in such inspiring ways.
Yeah, excellent.
Thank you both for that. And I think, I'd love to stay here all day and hear your insights on all of the questions we have popping up. But unfortunately, I think we're running a little short on time. So maybe we have time for one or two more questions. I'd like to throw one out here that is in line with what you were just talking about, and maybe a little bit in sort of the anti-progress arena, which is, could you discuss what our strategy needs to be in addressing a large-scale political movement to attack the teaching of critical race theory and ethnic history in our schools and universities? These actions by political actors threaten our efforts to tell the whole story.
Oh, I would readily defer to Julie.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for who asked that very complicated question, but it's good. I think we've seen this a lot through history. So I'll go back to our purpose, that we really do need to think about the cues in history to see where we've been in these places before, and to be sure that we don't sleep ourselves or lull ourselves into the comfort of letting us get there again. I think that, in understanding who we serve and what we're thinking, we do serve the entire public. So the more we connect, the more that we talk with our neighbors and our partners, and that people see themselves included instead of excluded, we are bound to create policies for inclusion that don't just shift the person that's being discriminated, the group that's being discriminated against. And it's a very difficult set of propositions to try to create true equity and inclusion and to really look hard at the systemic problems and repairing them, and not be tempted just to repeat the mistakes that gave us the point where we are now. So I think history plays an important role in bringing us together, and that information, that knowledge will help to, I think, put us in the space that these threats will be something that we need to remember, because those are our public that we also serve. And these are people like our family members and our neighbors. And how do we create systems and processes that don't make anyone feel that they are excluded? And by doing that, and by using history, and by our strengthened partnerships, I feel like we can overcome these efforts in a way that will be more inclusive.
Excellent. Excellent, Judy.
Yeah. I have another question. The historic preservation movement has some racist underpinnings. How can we challenge our own origins effectively? And are there some good examples of this that you can think of?
If I may, I think again, to go back to leadership, it goes back to what is our personal or professional philosophical underpinning in terms of embracing the concept of diversity, equity, justice, and human dignity. Is it something that we can teach on the ground or in the classroom? Or is it something that we can influence by our own conduct? And I think for those of us who were the title of being a preservationist or historian or archaeologist, architect, anthropologist, or whatever the case may be, is that we have to become ambassadors, advocating the importance of our cultural stewardship. And we have to be living examples of that kind of a citizenship and stewardship. Gandhi stated so eloquently, be the change you want to see. That's our charge. As preservationists, we have to go into the neighborhood, to the community, to the school, to the churches, to the civil rights, educational, private business organizations, and advocate for the importance of preserving our heritage. It's not easy, but that's something we're accepted to do.
I agree, Bob, and I think often of Maya Angelou's comment or quote that we do what we know, and when we know better, we do better. And I'm not getting that exactly right, but I think we don't shy away from the ugly realities of our roots in preservation. They were of a time that we thankfully are moving away from. But also, I think, particularly, I'll speak about public policy. We really are, elected and appointed and employed to serve the people. And the beauty of that is that it's meant to be flexible enough to serve the voice of the people. And so all the work that you do every day, the things that you decide, we have a statewide plan we do every 5 years, and we go out to the public and ask you for your input, and we maybe get 35 people around the state that will provide information. I'd like to have 35,000 people telling us what you'd like to do. We really have to understand and take the opportunity to make the frameworks that are put for our interest, and frankly, that we pay for by our taxes, be in the spaces that we want them to be. It takes effort on our part, but it also then is flexible and malleable enough to be what communities want us to do. So as the head of a state office that looks at this issue of culture and preservation, we truly invite you all to join us. Tell us what you want. How would you like to see it? We have a State Historical Resources Commission that we're looking at committees going forward in the year of topics that are of interest to the public. So I invite you all to join us in changing this dynamic in a way that sees your goals, values, families, celebrations honored, commemorated, and celebrated.
Julia, I just strongly ditto what you have said. You know, we have the tools, we have the laws, we have the administrative systems. I think about the 106, the review process under the Historic Preservation Act. And what I sense is that there still is not a connection between large members of our public with the opportunity that they have to contribute or to input to what's going to take place with properties that's dear to them. Certainly true in the 102 provision of the Environmental Protection Act. We as practitioners in the field, we have to bridge those relationships, those connections, and get people actively involved to support their heritage preservation. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but I applaud what you said. Yeah, yeah.
Well, that is a perfect way to end this session. I want to thank you both, Julianne Polanco, Director Stanton, Christine Lazaredo. Thank you all for being here today. This is, I think, just a delightful and appropriate way to kick off this conference. For our attendees, we're going to go into a break, and the next session will begin at 10:30. If you haven't registered for the conference, you can do so at californiapreservation.org. We welcome you to join us for the remainder of the conference. I want to thank you again both so very much for participating in this conference. It is, again, perfect way to kick this conference off. So thank you.
We are grateful to you, Cindy, for your leadership and support.
Thank
Thank you very much.
Yeah, always delightful, Bob. And thank you to everybody watching. For the next couple of days, you'll be so inspired. And please just continue the good work and let us know how we can help. Thanks for joining us.